Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on strategies for low carbon EU by 2050. My name is Frédéric Simon from Euractiv. We're online media specialized in EU affairs, and I'm the editor in charge of the energy and environment section. Now, my understanding of finance is actually limited, so I'll limit my introduction to what I understand more easily, which is the policy aspect. So to summarize, the European Commission came out last month with an action plan on sustainable finance, which basically aims at steering investments in the green economy. Now, a lot of that is actually focused on climate change and investments in low carbon technologies, although the plan is actually wider and also covers things like socially responsible investments. So why is that important? Well, essentially because ultimately it can redirect trillions of dollars worth of investments in things like renewable energies. And it can also potentially negatively affect the market valuation of companies like BP, Exxon, Shell, which are involved in fossil fuel extraction. Now, there's a long way to go, of course, before that happens, but the impact of that could be massive. As you can imagine, it can really be a game changer. Now, the European Commission, as a regulator, took a first step last month with this action plan, and it will publish at the end of May its first actual piece of legislative proposal on the topic, essentially to try and clarify what can be labeled as green investment. So, for example, answering questions such as, can nuclear power be labeled as green? And this is relevant for the Hinkley Point discussion. Now, to speak about those issues today, I have the pleasure of introducing Aidan White, sitting next to me from the WWF European Policy Office in Brussels, Jan van der Moosten, to the other side, who does sustainable finance at the WWF in Brussels, Rachel Ward from the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change in London, and Tatiana Bastille, I hope, from Hermes Investment Management. Thank you all for joining us today. Each of the speakers will start by making a presentation of 10 minutes maximum to explain what they're doing, and then we'll move on to a Q&A session moderated by me. So please be ready to have your questions, and I'll try to take as many of them as possible. Now, please bear in mind as well that this discussion is taking place on the record, and so that anything that you say might be quoted in a forthcoming story on Euractiv. I guess that's all for me. And Aidan White, the floor is yours now for 7 minutes, actually.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, and hello everybody. Thank you for having us, and also to thank the IGCC for being the co-organizers of this webinar. Just a quick overview of the MaxiMiseR project. It was first thought of back in 2014 when we were looking at the monitoring mechanism regulation, which is a piece of EU legislation, part of which requires member states to produce what were then called low carbon development strategies, 2050 plans for decarbonizing their economies. And it has developed from 2014 to now, partly in line with the way the EU legislation in this area has also developed, with the monitoring mechanism regulation set to be replaced by the governance regulation, which is currently being negotiated between the EU institutions, and also follows up with more detail on the requirement on member states to produce long-term climate strategies. So I'm here to give a bit of an introduction into the strategies and why they matter, and how the MaxiMiseR project has sought to raise their profile. Okay. So the first thing to note is what we think of as a low carbon development strategy. This is the project definition, as you can see. Obviously, it needs to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and it needs to set a target of well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5 degrees, as the Paris Agreement has agreed. We also feel that they need to secure the well-being and prosperity of all citizens. They should set clear goals, explain how those goals will be achieved, be based on scientific understanding, and also involve a transparent process of stakeholder participation. So this definition has been developed over the course of the project. It's something that we have reiterated a couple of times, but we really think it encompasses more or less the essence of what a long-term, a 2050 strategy should include. And it's important to note that the project that talks about low carbon development strategies, because this was the principal nomenclature at the time in 2014. But now there's lots of different names for them: long-term climate plans, 2050 plans, mid-century strategies. They all basically mean the same thing. They all basically mean a plan out to 2050 and beyond. And we think that they should all encompass these key aspects. The next slide, please. So the MaxiMiseR project has produced a number of publications, but the two key publications are these two. So A Climate for the Future is our assessment of the different member states' plans that have been submitted under the monitoring mechanism regulation. There are a number, but not all, member states who produce plans, and we'll get into that in a bit. And they have submitted them in two different rounds. The first round was in 2015, and the second round was in 2017. And this Climate for the Future report has been updated at each round of submission. The other paper is kind of the other side of the coin of the assessment of the plans, and that is the guidance that we have produced, including what we think the 10 key points that each plan should include. And so they're kind of two sides of the same coin. One is testing the plans, and the other is providing guidance to member states on what the plan should include. And while we don't think that planning to succeed is necessarily definitive, it does include what we hope is a very useful bibliography of all the resources we read when we were developing that guidance. So it's kind of, we hope, a way in for both policymakers and civil society working on these long-term plans to kind of find more and more detail should they need it. So firstly, we can see the results of the Climate for the Future assessments, and these show the 2015 and 2017 scores of the member states who have submitted a long-term low-carbon strategy. Obviously, France is the strongest, Cyprus is the weakest, but really the thing to note is there are only, even in 2017, 13 member states. The two new ones were Estonia and the Czech Republic. And the other thing to note, though, is that there have been some notable improvements, such as Ireland jumping up from a 40% score in our criteria up to above 70%. So there is some progress with new plans and plans being improved, but still it's clear that member states aren't all fully engaged on the need for 2050 strategies, and that's something we continue to work on. So this is the main kind of infographic that came out of the Planning to Succeed guidance. And obviously there we highlight the 10 key elements that we think need to be well reflected in a successful long-term plan. The ambition, the scope covering all the different sectors of the economy, how actionable it is, whether it takes into account other relevant plans from government, the political commitment behind the plan. So, you know, is there clear leadership for it? Does it have a legal basis? And then some of the more technical aspects, like the monitoring of the plan, how it gets reported upon, how transparent it is, how clear it is, easy it is for the public to understand and find information on, the degree to which stakeholders were engaged, what the underlying analytical basis is of the plan, and also how it can be reviewed. So that, for example, review could include a kind of a timed review, so every 5 years, or a triggered review. So if there's a significant change in the international context, such as the Paris Agreement, that should trigger a review of plans in our view. So now we move on to the joint statement, which is kind of the public-facing aspect of what we have learned through the project and through those publications I highlighted. And the joint statement is, we're very happy to have signatories from across society and the economy, business, civil society, public authorities, trade unions, and investors, including the IIGCC, which you can see there, have signed the statement. And it highlights really, to a large extent, the need to create certainty for investors. And that can be done through, for example, binding 2050 targets with clear processes, reporting and reviewing strategies, all the kind of aspects that we highlight both in the assessments and in the guidance I spoke about. And we also feel that the statement also makes clear that the signatories agree that these strategies should cover the whole economy, all sources and sinks of emissions, and also broader economic, social, and environmental issues to ensure that there's really a holistic approach to how we plan for the transformation that is needed in order to be where we need to be in 2050 to keep temperatures down and protect the environment. So that was a kind of a whistle-stop tour. I guess if there's any questions for clarification, otherwise we'll move through the
yeah, I think we can take the questions for later in the Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you.
Right, Jan van der Moosten, it's your time.
Thank you. And also thank you for inviting us to participate in this webinar. So I'm very, very happy to present a project that we are coordinating from the WWF European Policy Office on aligning investor portfolios with the Paris Agreement. Next slide. So I'll start by quickly introducing the project before I present one of our key publications, namely our climate guide to asset owners. So what we do in this project is that we target the 100 largest asset owners across 12 European countries, which you can see on this slide. And the focus of this project is mainly on driving asset owners to align their investment portfolios with the Paris Agreement. So very much a focus on engaging directly with these asset owners about how they can change their policies, their processes, and ultimately their investment portfolios. We also, however, want to push these asset owners to become drivers of change, by which we mean that they influence external stakeholders like financial service providers, portfolio companies, but also policymakers. We think that there is an incentive for asset owners, which are like pension funds, insurance companies, that generally have a long-term investment horizon to address climate change and the risks and opportunities that come with climate change. Given that there is a growing body of evidence from, you could say, reputed research organizations that indicate that investing in line with a 2-degree transition pathway will offer the lowest risk as well as maximize financial returns, especially over the long run. Next slide, please. So we have published, great, a number of publications, and I will here focus on the first one, which is our climate guide to asset owners. That one, exactly. But I just wanted to say that we have also published more specific guides on coal mining and electric power utilities. So if anyone is interested to know more about these specific guides, we can also respond to questions about this either on this webinar or later. Next slide, please. So our approach basically for our project, and I realize it's really quite similar to the MaxiMiseR project, is where we, on one hand, we will do research on investment portfolios, but we have also done an extensive review of existing literature on climate risk and what asset owners can do with regards to climate change, and have a very detailed asset owner guide, 70 pages, where we put all of this together. But based on a very extensive guide, we have also published a summary guide, which has these 15 recommendations to asset owners. So they are aimed at asset owners mainly, so I repeat, it's pension funds and insurance companies mainly, but many of these recommendations, I believe, are also relevant for other investors. And we have basically organized it in three parts, which we believe are key roles of asset owners. So the first on the left is about learning. We believe it's very important for investors to understand the risks and opportunities of climate change, and in particular to measure these risks, which is the second recommendation, both climate risk and how their portfolios compare with the climate goals. There is a growing number of tools available that allow investors to do this. And once you understand basically the risks and the opportunities, the next step is to include it in your decision making and your internal processes. That's mainly, of course, integrating climate change in your investment policy, but also setting targets. And what we think is very important is that we should develop tools and metrics that allow to set such targets. It's currently not yet available, but asset owners and investors can contribute to developing these tools. And then the final part, and this is where we come to policymakers, is that while you integrate climate change in your own procedures and processes, you should also engage with stakeholders. And that is for asset owners, mainly investment managers, but also the companies in your portfolio and policymakers. Next slide, please. And so that brings me to our recommendations to policymakers. So we believe that investors can engage with policymakers basically on three types of regulation. The first one is ensuring that climate and energy policies drive a timely implementation of the Paris Agreement. But also investors can engage on corporate disclosure policies and improving these so that they have a better view on how the companies they invest in are prepared to address climate risk and harness opportunities. And finally, engage on financial policies and regulation. And it was mentioned by Frédéric, there is a really interesting development now on EU level with the EU high-level expert group reports and the ensuing European Commission Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And probably something that could be interesting to look into is how that Sustainable Finance Action Plan can help the development of low carbon development strategies or contribute to their implementation. So to finish, asset owners and investors, in our opinion, should advocate for the adoption of ambitious low carbon development strategies by member states. But at the same time, our view is that they should not only advocate for this, but also actively contribute to the realization of these strategies by aligning their own investments with long-term climate goals. So I'll leave it with that and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks for making a relatively brief presentation. Let me turn now on the investors side to Rachel Ward, who's joining from London. Rachel, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great, thank you very much, Frédéric, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Ward, and I'm the head of policy at the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a network of 154 investors from 11 European countries with just over 21 trillion euros in assets under management. And our members are all committed to taking action and mobilizing capital for a prosperous low carbon future. So today I'm just going to briefly talk about why climate policy matters to investors, what makes so-called investable policy, and what the EU can learn from a couple of global case studies. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So firstly, investors care about climate change because many of them are invested across all economic sectors and geographies, which makes them uniquely exposed to systemic global challenges such as climate change. They see risks to be managed in terms of ensuring the resilience of their existing investments and also in preventing stranded assets. But they also see huge investment opportunities as part of the low carbon transition through new technologies, new markets and new business models. So for these reasons, many investors are already very active in tackling climate change. For example, the global share of low carbon supply side energy investments grew from 37% to 43% between 2014 and 2016. And a global study by HSBC last year showed that 2/3 of investors were planning to increase their investments related to tackling climate change. And this number actually increased to 97% of respondents in Europe. Investors are also increasingly committed to reporting on climate-related risks through the recommendations of the FSB's task force on climate-related finance disclosure, and also through a global initiative called Climate Action 100+, where 256 investors with $28 trillion in assets are now engaging actively as shareholders with the world's highest emitting companies. However, all of this really positive existing action could be scaled up and accelerated with the right enabling policy framework. And that's because clear long-term legislative programs are really critical to the ability of investors both to assess and manage climate-related risks and to invest in opportunities that can support a low-carbon, more climate-resilient world. And just to give an example of the role that policy plays, in 2017, IIGCC and our sister organisation in Australia and New Zealand undertook member surveys where around 80% of the respondents said that policy or regulatory uncertainty remained major challenges for investment. And in particular, investors cited the need for clarity around how governments intend to transition to a low carbon economy and meet the obligations of the Paris Agreement. Can I have the next slide, please? So what makes good policy from an investor point of view? The countries that have been vocal about the potential of low carbon energy and that have then implemented long-term plans for its deployment are the ones that we see succeed in delivering investment. The potential for long-term returns, coupled with clear and transparent regulation and predictable legal protections, will attract significant capital. So on the slide that you can see, I boiled down a top 4 list of very high level policy conditions that tend to feature in all of our policy advocacy and engagement, whether that's related to carbon pricing, vehicle emissions, energy or buildings, or more holistic policies such as 2050 strategies. In general, investors will look for, firstly, a political environment which is clearly and deeply committed to a low carbon future up to the most senior levels of government, and that this commitment is based on a good understanding of climate change risks and opportunities. Secondly, that there's a policy need for the project, for example, to meet environmental or energy targets. Thirdly, that there's a stable and transparent regulatory framework in place which minimises the risk to investors, for example, by including predictable long-term revenue streams insulated from change, that includes low carbon technologies and markets as a component of a long-term energy plan, and that also expressly rejects any retroactive changes to policy. And all of this, very importantly, should be embedded in a long-term perspective that is consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to take you quickly through 3 examples of where some of these policy conditions have been successfully applied. And as a caveat, I should note that I've included these examples just for illustrative purposes, as an indicative look at how policy can be used to attract low carbon investment. So the first example relates to South Africa. Here, to increase electrification and to meet new demand, the government set a goal for new generating capacity, of which a significant amount would come through renewables procured through auctions. The South African Treasury designed the scheme with high-level political commitments and the goal to a stable system. They also put in place a quasi-sovereign guarantee of payments, and as a result, the programme saw bid auctions oversubscribed, costs lowered, billions in private finance mobilised, and nearly 100% of winning projects proceeding to construction and operation. Next slide, please. The second example comes from Mexico. Here, the government set a goal for 50% of clean energy by 2050 alongside a market liberalisation programme. They created a new independent and transparent agency for energy, and they put in place a renewable energy quota system on electricity suppliers. Procurement was based on 15-year fixed price contracts. And as a result, the programme has attracted $13.5 billion in 5 years in investment, and over 60% of Mexico's new energy capacity will come as a result from clean technologies. Next slide, please. And then my third example comes from Norway. Here, obviously, costs for renewables are already fairly low, and Norway has in place a renewables target and a broader support system. However, even with this positive starting point, a particular wind project was struggling to secure investment due to a limitation of 5-year price fixes. So in quite an innovative move, Google stepped in and agreed to buy all of the project's electricity for 12 years at a fixed price. This was only possible through Norway's liquid and open market, which allowed for non-discriminatory access to the grid. So as a result of this, long-term capital was secured for the project, not just from institutional investors, but also from 2 commercial banks and from the Danish Credit Export Agency. Next slide, please. So what lessons can we draw from all of this in the EU? In general, the EU is starting from very solid foundations. Overall, it's on track to meet its 2020 targets. We've had ETS reforms and proposals under the Clean Energy Package, which go some way to providing a clear pathway to 2030. And the recent Sustainable Finance Action Plan is seeking to join up the financial markets with the broader low carbon transition in the real economy. However, to meet the targets set in the Clean Energy Package, the Commission itself has calculated that at least €380 billion per year of investment will be needed between 2020 and 2030, mostly in energy efficiency, renewables and infrastructure. So this is obviously a huge investment opportunity, but in order to attract the capital of this magnitude that's necessary, policymakers need to be aware of the potential pitfalls in current and future negotiations and try to avoid these where possible. For example, it's vital that all relevant EU policies, from the carbon market through to energy, finance, buildings and transport, are all consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement in terms of a 1.5 to 2 degree goal. These policies should also be anchored in a long-term plan, long-awaited 2050 roadmap strategy plan, whatever it's going to be called, which should include a defined role for investment and private finance alongside a carbon neutrality target. And in parallel to setting clear, long-term and ambitious objectives and plans, policymakers, and here I'm really talking about member states in particular, must be wary of the impact that negative political rhetoric can have on investor confidence. The EU does have long-standing commitments to tackling climate change through its robust policymaking, and with each new relevant discussion, it's really vital that this commitment remains visibly at the forefront of the negotiations. The resulting investor confidence will support decisions in allocating the capital that's needed to finance the low carbon transition across Europe. So I'll leave it there and I look forward to your questions after the presentations. Thank you.
Hi again. So thank you, Rachel, for that. Let me turn now to Tatiana Bastille from Hermit Investment Management. Tatiana, if you can hear us.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes we can.
I should be on. Lovely. Thank you, everyone. Always that moment where we feel technology may be failing us. Thanks, everyone. I'm very pleased to be able to join our previous speaker I am working with Hermes Investment Management, which is an investment management firm which has at the very heart of our DNA what we call the holistic returns approach, which means that we believe that we need to invest for the long term, but also with a very clear vision that the reason we are investing is for the beneficiaries of our pension funds clients and insurance clients. If I can have the next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? Can I control it myself? Yes, I can. That's fine. The reason I was asked to come and speak to you is to explain, following on the work that Rachel has presented to you on the policy side, and at Hermes we are active contributors to the work by GCC, was to give you a view as to why, from an investor perspective, long-term matters. And as I said at the beginning, we are in a moment of transition, and in discussions we are having across the industry, we do recognize that we need to rethink what is the purpose of the investment industry. You might have heard about the high-level expert group on sustainable finance and the follow-up action plan by the European Commission on sustainable finance. There are a lot of questions out there about what does it mean. So in Hermes, the way we look at it is very much thinking that if we want to provide sustainable returns to our beneficiaries, which are pensioners, we are still owned by the British Telecom Pension Scheme. There's about 100,000 pensioners. We have to deliver not only a pensions at the end of their work life, but also ensure that the monies that they have put in their investment fund has delivered a real economy and a service economy where they can have a good quality of life to use those investments. So it has to have not only invest in sustainable companies and assets, have strong risk-adjusted financial returns, of course, but also the societal benefits and the environmental benefits which would benefit those users. So it's really about putting the interests of clients and their ultimate beneficiaries front and center. Next slide, please. One seminal moment has happened in pushing really this agenda forward a few years back now, when Mark Carney, as head of the UK Central Bank, has made it very clear that studies were showing that climate represented a strategic risk to the financial stability of our systems. So this was the very first time that central bankers were putting climate as a financial stability risk, which is of course very important. I was quite amused when I was preparing my slides to show that you have those white old men there. We are a lot of younger people on the phone here today, but they've really made a major change, because he then went on to the Financial Stability Board to represent the central banks of the G20 countries and said, we need to do something about it. So jointly with Bloomberg, they established a task force on climate financial disclosure, which has now delivered some very strong recommendations, which are pragmatic but strong recommendations on how the financial market should disclose better on climate. And why do I mention that here in terms of the perspective of long term is because it has really shifted the view of a number of institutional investors about why should we be looking at climate and long term. And if I can have the next slide, please. Another important reason is that as we are looking at climate risk within Hermes, within larger investment organizations and across the investment sectors, Mark Carney mentioned something which was very important. He came up with this notion of the tragedy of the horizons. The investment decisions that we make today will have impacts, such as climate impacts, in the longer term, which are becoming more and more medium term, but definitely longer term, versus investment decisions that we need to make today when I speak to my investment managers, which at best would probably vary between 3 to 5 years, and at worst into the next quarter. So how do we bridge that? And another important element to this longer term is that we strongly believe that a transition or a just transition to a low carbon economy will see some losers, which are the risks, such as we are hearing a lot about stranded asset in fossil fuel sector, but they will also create major opportunities, which is something we believe is not probably often enough pushed forward. And so it's about understanding where the market is going, where are the growth opportunities going forward. So, for example, renewable and clean energy investment have increased exponentially in the last few years. We know that certain industries are having major transformation from within, could be the automotive industries, or there are certain sectors such as the building sector present major cost-effective opportunities. So next slide. So the real question we have as investors is, if we believe that we need to invest for the long term, for the benefits of our beneficiaries, how do we bridge that gap? How do we bridge that tragedy of the horizon? And so working with the like of IIGCC and the UNEP-FI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, we have done a lot of work on a number of fronts. The one important one, going back to this notion of long term, is on fiduciary duty. It's about ensuring that pension schemes, that insurance companies have as part of their fiduciary duty, which defines the regulatory framework within which they make their investment decision, have a clear understanding that long term is in the interest of their beneficiaries. And so a lot of work has been done with now 16 countries and regulators, country-specific regulators, to look at how to make explicit that a fiduciary duty should look at long term. We were very pleased in 2006 to see at the EU level what I call the Pension Schemes Directive, for simplicity, has incorporated the notion that fiduciary duty means looking at longer term and in particular climate impact. That was part of a study we did back in 2015 and 16 with IIGCC, which was really pushing for the alignment of the EU financial system and climate change. We were very pleased to see that in the last few years, under Dombrovskis, Vice President Dombrovskis, we had a high-level expert group on sustainable finance, which had led to the European Commission Action Plan on sustainable growth, on financing sustainable growth, which has really brought a lot of insights into how are we going to transform the system. Because bridging the tragedy of the horizon is very much about ensuring that the like of Hermes and other investors who are like-minded are enabled to implement within their short-term constraint their long-term ambitions. Next slide, please. And how does this bring us to climate policy? Rachel presented the work that we have done at the policy level. It's also really worth emphasizing the support there is today from the investors community for a strong and clear and ambitious climate policy. Just last year, as part of the G20 presidency of Germany, there was a lot of pressure. It was just after Trump became president of the US. There was a lot of pressure on the climate agreement, on Paris, and the meaning. And investors really came together very, very strongly. So there were 390 investors representing more than 22 trillion in assets under management, which is a major representation of the investment markets, who had a very active engagement with the G20 leaders to say, we want you to confirm to us and to give us a very strong signal, because we believe it's very important to secure our financial returns in the long term, that the Paris Agreement is here to stay. And so we were very pleased to have the leaders' declaration in that perspective. Another very clear signal, in September last year, the Principles for Responsible Investment in-person conference, a question was asked. There was about 1,000 participants. It's really growing in interest. And they were asked, what is your key ESG concern? And the majority, the large majority, emphasized that it was climate. Next slide, please. And so this leads us to, what do we then do as an investment management company? So what we have done in Hermes is to do a lot of work internally to engage and educate our investment managers, and we've published these findings in reports that we have published in the last 3 years about what are are more formal process for integrating carbon risk, but also opportunities. And what we have found is that there is still a lot of work to be done. If you can go to the next slide, please. A lot of work to be done to educate investors in order to enable them to make an informed decision that accounts for that long term. So that this holistic return approach that we have means that they don't only look at today's or the next quarter or the next 2 years capital values or the market valuation at a given time, but they also look at the broader sets of risk and opportunities, such as what are the regulatory pressure coming up, what are the growth opportunities, how are the markets transforming, is there going to be some stranded assets? And so we do that through what we call a positive feedback loop of both being aware of our exposure, integrating our process, and very importantly, we strongly believe that we need to engage with the company that we invest in to ask them. And this is also part of the Financial Stability Board Task Force on Climate Disclosure, to ask them, do you have an understanding of climate risk to your business? How are you addressing and mitigating those in the long term? How can we work together to ensure that you align yourself to a 2 degree or 1.5 climate scenario going forward? And finally, the work that we are doing with IGCC is fundamental, because in order to really bridge that tragedy of the horizon and enable a real long-term investment, we are going to have to change the investment chain. All of the players need to have a very clear understanding of their fiduciary duty and of the value to them of taking that long-term perspective. Very pleased to take some questions, and I hope that brings a different insight as to why investors are taking this long-term perspective very seriously, but also some of the constraints that we are facing today to put it into practice.
Let me open the discussion here, so anybody attending can put your questions online. I think there's a tool that you can use to put your questions in writing, and we'll select a number of them. And let me maybe start by following up on what you said, Tatiana. So you said there was still a lot of work to be done to educate investors, but is education really enough? I mean, you know, investors typically, they look for a quick and easy return, and just, you know, they're looking just to make money. So is education really enough? I mean, if you want to get something done, you need to do something a bit more fundamental, right?
I quite agree with you. I think all of those initiatives that we are taking have to be taken in parallel. Now, so this is why we have been actively advocating for a transformation to the financial system. And for example, at the European level, we have done really great inroads into ensuring that there is, for example, an alignment of DG FISMA financial regulation with DG Energy and DG Climate targets to 2020, 2030, etc. We acknowledge we still have some work to do there, but the action plan is a great step in that direction. I think it's also, I would like to clarify that not all investors look to do a big buck in a small time. You do have some of them in the market, of course, but the way institutional investors work, first, we are universal owners. Second, we have a very important exposure to a number of sectors. So while one mitigation option might be the exit strategy of I sell while I can when the market is at the high price, we are very clear that the risks are much bigger than that. And by educating investors, what I meant to say is very much enabling them as part to give them the information, the tools, the knowledge, the vision as to where the markets are going into the future, to enable them to make an informed decision. So for example, in Hermes, we have very specific tools which give them information about the ESG characteristics of certain assets. We have a dedicated risk tool that provides information on not only the carbon footprint, but also what are the information we get from our engagement, what is the carbon risk management strategies, are they aware of the need to have a mitigation approach or not, which is could be the situation, or are they looking into the impact that climate regulation, physical impacts of or transition risk to climate in terms of their supply chain might have to their business model, and do they have a business plan to address that? So by educating the investors, it's very much enabling them to make an informed decision. We, for example, in Hermes believe that divestment should be the last resort. Because let's take an example. We have engaged and we are invested in a Danish fossil fuel company, but they have a model to transition to renewable energy. So if you look at the carbon footprint 2 years ago, you would never have invested with them because they were mainly coal-based. But if you look at their business plan, they have a business plan which is one of transition. So you could either divest, but then they will have to go to someone else to get the monies, or you engage with them and you facilitate that transition and reward that transition. We also recognize that it does take time. And when I say educate the financial market, it's not just the investors, it's also the advisors are very important. It's fundamental to see how advisors are providing this knowledge to the trustees of pension schemes, and how that in time could influence the type of mandates that you have. We have very few mandates today, which is in asset owners or pension funds saying to people like Hermes investment managers, could you please go and invest specifically in climate-related themes, or can you ensure that across all of our mandates, you do have a climate risk strategy which is on board? The tendency tends to give much more freedom to the investment managers, but having clear mandates could transform fundamentally the investment industry. There's also a lot of work that needs to be done into what is sustainable finance, what is a low carbon finance, in order to help investors identify opportunities and also have the ability to see through a company's business plan to see whether they are genuine in addressing the risk or not.
Let me ask a specific question, because this is something I heard from the chairman of the high-level group at the European Commission. He was talking about, you know, the ways of encouraging investors to go massively for green investments. And so he was saying at some point you might want to consider what he calls a brown penalizing factor for the some kind of fossil fuels assets typically, and also, I mean, and on the other hand, a green bonus type of thing, like lower capital requirements, for example, for green loans and things like that. How hopeful are you that something like this can materialize pretty quickly? You know, there's a proposal coming from the European Commission in May on the taxonomies. But how do you think can a proposal like the brown penalizing factor or the green bonus can be adopted?
The way I see that is, it's not going to be black and white, but you do see a number of asset classes where it is already happening. And I don't think it's going to come from the regulator. That is going to be very much the market. If you think about where we are today compared to 3 years ago in terms of the position of a number of pension funds when it comes to fossil fuel, and especially, let's say, high carbon content fossil fuel companies, and where there is some degree of commitments to not invest in coal, some degree of commitments to not invest in sand-tars, etc. So we are already seeing those companies, in effect, having a brown discount because they don't get access to the capital that they had access to before. On another asset class, which I have done quite a lot of work on, which is real estate and infrastructure, we are actually seeing today that being very clearly taken into consideration in the assessment of building. If I am quite, I think, to be very transparent, regulation has played a big role on that, because we do have strict building regulation, we have strict requirements for certain regulated infrastructure assets, which means that there is now a regulatory requirement for a certain green standard, and assets which don't have the standards are penalized by a lower value because they don't meet the specifications that the market expects, while new assets that go beyond the standards, and we have collected with IGCC and others evidence over the years, are clearly seeing a financial benefit. Now, we've done a lot of work trying to identify what I call the graal of the green premium. You can't really do that. First, because the data is very noisy, because the financial market cycles means that you don't have historical statistical evidence over enough time. But clearly, speak to any real estate investor today, and they will all have enough anecdotal evidence that as part of their strategy, investing beyond building regulation into green building specification has become the norm for central business districts, high-spec buildings. Now, real estate is a very heterogeneous sector, so it needs still to percolate down, but that is one example where you do see the appearance of these premiums. And the same, to be fair, applies in some other sectors.
Okay, so but I understand that the first part of your answer was, no, you don't expect that much coming from the regulators on the green premium or the brown penalty.
Per se, I mean, I don't think they're going to define what the premium is or what the penalty is, but indeed having transparency and more disclosure will enable the market to see through and to give different pricing over time to certain assets.
Yeah, and so
but
the market
it's going to take some time.
And the market will act by itself. Jan van der Moosten, you wanted to react?
Yes, very interesting, and I was quite happy to see that the way Hermes kind of recommends investors to integrate climate change corresponds with what we have in our climate guide. I'd like to kind of confirm from our experience of the network and engaging with asset owners that there is indeed still a lot of work to be done for like investors to really understand the risks of climate change. For instance, we are having a lot of discussions with asset owners of basically asking them if they want to assess how their portfolios compare with the targets of the Paris Agreement using a very specific and forward-looking tool. And then you notice that many of these asset owners, they haven't really thought about this a lot at all. So and generally very much appreciate as well starting this discussion on the basis of a very concrete tool that they can use. So that's definitely something that we also experience. Also, I think very much agree with your view that it's really important to not only focus on divesting from companies, but that there is place for engaging with companies. And I see there were some questions as well about how shareholder resolutions can be a tool for engaging companies. We do think that engagement can be useful, but until now hasn't really have like a great track record. And we should really take into account that it's very urgent to quickly have impacts of your engagement work, because basically addressing climate change is a very urgent issue, and we should really quickly see a shift from companies from brown to green technologies. So in that regard, we think engagement should be what we call forceful. You should assess if a company really has an opportunity to shift its business model, and if not, you should divest. And if you feel it has opportunities to shift the business model, you should engage, but with very clear demands and timelines. And if a company does not respond to your questions, for instance, to adopt the Paris compliant business plan, to shut down high carbon assets, to set in place a timeline to develop green technologies and close down the assets, you should divest as well. So engagement, yes, but forceful and also public, not just behind closed doors. That can happen through shareholder resolutions, but can be done in many different ways. And for instance, a really interesting development that we have seen recently is the setup of the Climate Action 100+ initiative, where you get different coalitions that come together, clearly make public which companies they're engaging with, are going to engagement with what kind of question. And the question is, adopt targets that are in line with the Paris Agreement. So this kind of public engagement, clear demands, is what we really need to see a lot more. And maybe finally, coming back to the action plan, something that starts, I know,
ENC.
with something happening, yeah, with investors, is that if an asset owner or an investor wants to align with the Paris Agreement, it is not enough to just increase investments in green technologies. You also have to reduce your exposure to brown technologies, to polluting technologies. And the framework should basically push the financial sector to do both. And there is where we see that the action plan of the European Commission is focusing a lot on the green technologies, but could do more on brown technologies. For instance, there is a green taxonomy that will be developed, but maybe there should also be a taxonomy of what is polluting or brown technologies, or how do you call it? The green supporting factor should also have a polluting part to it. So,
and so on the policymaking side, that is not happening. The taxonomies are just how green you are, not how brown.
Exactly. Yeah. So that could be improved in our opinion, and as well try to push, for instance, not only the development of green bonds, but greening the bond market in general, or not only assessing how sustainable funds are doing, but also major benchmarks, how are they performing against the climate targets, because that's what really important is, that these benchmarks become more sustainable. So there is like to say that the action plan is very bold and probably the most ambitious in the world, but there is still parts that can be improved.
Does anybody want to react to this? Tatiana or Rachel, is that something that makes you a tick?
Maybe if I may, and then Rachel, you might want to come in on the first on the asset owners. I agree that there has been a slow uptake of interest, but first with the Paris Agreement, there's been a massive shift, and now with the recommendation from the Financial Stability Board, we are seeing another one of those plateau of interest. So based on the work we've done for the last 3 years, I've met so many asset owners in the last 3 months, really are all saying, how do we do that? Fully recognize that the alignment to 2 degree and 1.5 degree scenarios is really early stages, and a number of initiatives are there, including 2 degree investing initiative, which have done really good work on that, partly supported by the European Commission Horizon 2020. So we are still in this phase of sense making. What does it mean? For example, in the work we are doing, we came to the conclusion that what we need to do is to take those high-level scenarios, translate them so they apply to a company and then a portfolio, and then provide what are the signals that investors should be tracking to see whether or not the alignment is happening between a company and portfolio versus this rather long-term target. So fully recognize that this is completely work in progress. The positive thing is that I know about 20 TCFD initiatives. Rachel, you can correct me if I'm wrong, going on. We are probably part of 5, and we're not quite sure how to keep abreast of it. But I think that 2018 is really the year where people are trying to make sense of it, and we need to really get there. In terms of engagement, I fully agree with you. I think Hermes was among the very leading companies on engagement. We've been doing that for over 20 years. And indeed, it is a slow process. However, when you see how the relevance of engagement as a tool for investment has picked up over the last few years, in part thanks to the PRI, in part now a lot of work with IGCC. You probably have heard about the Action 100+. Rachel, you might want to remind me how many organizations are in there, but we have now tripled the number of organizations committed to active engagement. And in terms of outcomes, you can go onto Hermes website, and we do actually have description of the outcomes from our engagement, and in particular with the oil and gas companies. There's been some major work in forcing them to disclose their risk, in forcing them to think about having targets, which have come directly as an impact of what is now the Climate 100, because the momentum and the number of shareholders which are putting pressure, as well as the regulatory framework, is there to push it through. Now, we all agree that we would like this to go a little bit faster, but in Hermes, we still strongly believe that that is the way to do so. And we are going to put more and more pressure for those disclosures to be much more comprehensive and to move on to specific targets as to what those companies are going to do. In terms of the action plan, I'm not quite sure that I agree with you when the focus needs to be on green. I don't think we want to come to an exclusion list, because as I said, when you dig into companies, it's not because you're an oil and gas company that you're a bad company. Because as I said, Dong Energy, for example, have a strategy to shift to 100% renewables. So you need to allow a certain flexibility in the assessment of those companies. You have some utility companies which are very, very active in smart metering, energy efficiency, and so you want to invest in that. Maybe I've spoken quite a lot, so Rachel, do you want to say a word?
Yeah, thanks, Tatiana. I just have 3 quick comments. So firstly, on aligning portfolios with 2 degree or 1.5 degree scenarios, we do see a lot of good practice among the kind of leading members of IIGCC. But there are a lot of investors who are very keen to try and adopt these kinds of models, but they struggle given that there's no kind of consensus from a government point of view over what the best tool or technique to use is. So what we're doing internally at the moment under a new program that we have on investor practices is conducting a series of interviews with some of the leaders in this space to look at possible guides on scenario planning for investors. So we accept that there's a lot more to be done on this, but there is appetite out there, and that there's some good practice as well to move that forward. On the kind of green versus brown, I think, yes, that there does need to be more of a balance. That said, investors have been very active and continue to be active in trying to engage governments in getting rid of some of the current incentives that are out there for brown, just to level the playing field. So, for example, we advocate for phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and for governments to phase out thermal coal power. We're also working closely with the Powering Past Coal Alliance that the UK and Canadian governments are spearheading. And then in parallel to the kind of green taxonomies that the Commission will be proposing, hopefully that will provide a kind of a clearer way through in terms of signals for investment. That said, what we do find, and it's linked to the engagement piece, is that many investors do prefer to, for now anyway, maintain their shares in some of the browner companies. And I would say that they see very much that there's a spectrum here, you know, with coal very much at one end, but then other sectors maybe more in the middle, where they see that there's a potential for improvements. And for those guys, they do want to be able to have the conversations while they have levers as shareholders, in order to try and make sure that the cleanest technologies and processes and government structures are being adopted within companies. So there was a question about resolutions. That's part of the toolkit that investors use, and some of them have been very successful just over the last 18 months or so, but it's a part of the conversation, and lots goes on behind the scenes. Lots is done in collaboration. So obviously Climate Action 100+, which has been mentioned a few times, Tatiana, it's 256 investors with nearly $30 trillion who are taking a very coordinated and organized approach to targeting the world's biggest emitting companies. The kind of justification being that if they choose to divest and sell their shares, they're just being passed on to somebody else who may not have the same approach to climate change that they do. So while they're in a position of influence and they see the potential for positive change, they want to try and pursue that approach as much as possible. But it's a constant process of assessing where they are, and if they don't feel that progress has been made, many investors are willing to say, well, we're pulling out in that case, and that would be the ultimate kind of end of the line, but up until that point, it's about having the conversation. Thanks.
Right, let me maybe take a few questions from the participants.
Hi everyone, this is Leah from the MaxiMiseR project. I'm just going to try and go through some of the unanswered questions. So we have a question from Ian Cochran from I4CE on how investment needs will need to be involved, and within that how the financial community and other sources of capital will need to be involved. We also have a question from Nicholas who asks WWF and Hermes what our views are on filing shareholder resolutions relative to direct engagement with a company. Then we have Paula from WWF Chile who asks us to share our experiences beyond broad climate change frameworks on concrete examples of initiatives where governments have worked with investors to guide them on infrastructure, technology and other areas that a country might need. And then we have a question from Anna Laurent from IEEP who would like to hear a bit more about the role of investors in relation to climate adaptation, specifically how investors can also advance climate resilience through, for example, infrastructural investments or resilience fund types of mechanisms. So I think a lot of these questions can be answered by Rachel, Jan, Adam, and Tatiana. So I think I'll pass over to Adam first because I think he wants to answer some of the more MaxiMiseR specific questions. And then Rachel, I don't know if you want to also step in after Adam.
Yeah, I'll avoid all the technical ones because Jan is much better placed from EPO to answer those questions, certainly. There was a question from Ian about how long-term plans and indeed 2030 plans, which in the EU we're calling national energy and climate plans, how they can integrate finance or investment plans, and he raises the point that MaxiMiseR is kind of getting to grips with that, and that's indeed true. We focus mainly on the need for long-term plans to integrate properly with other relevant government plans. That would include things like adaptation plans, but also definitely investment and financing plans. And also part of the MaxiMiseR assessment focused on kind of the credibility for delivery of the government's plans. So if they had, a lot of nice goals, even maybe a binding 2050 target, but there was no plan underneath that for how that would be financed, either through public or private money, who would be responsible for delivery, where the kind of investment confidence would come from, then they still didn't score well. So that was kind of how we've addressed it so far. We've engaged increasingly over time with the investment community, partly through Jan's work and through direct contacts with people like IGCC, because we see how important that is and is becoming. With obviously energy projects in particular have a long lead time, so things that are getting built now will still be around in 2050, and therefore we're quite clear on the need to focus increasingly on that area.
Okay, maybe Rachel, there was one question I think about the engagement of shareholders.
Maybe on that, there was a specific question whether we also file shareholders resolution, and the answer is very, very much so. In Hermes, we have 400 billions of assets under advice, i.e. that we represent, and that is what we do. A big part of our work is about voting and filing specific shareholder resolutions. And what I've mentioned about the Climate 100 Plus is not just about direct engagement with company, but it has very much been about filing specific shareholders resolution, asking for companies in the oil and gas, but also in the transport, in the chemical sectors, to come up with very specific plan and answer to very specific questions that shareholders have. So that is quite correct. On the infrastructure side, it's one area where in Hermes we do have an infrastructure team that I work with. It tends to be in private market, which is slightly different from the engagement that we were speaking about, but it's quite correct that there is quite a lot of engagement between private infrastructure investors and government on what is needed, but also a lot of assets are regulated. If you think about energy assets, if you think, let's say, the gas distribution network, if you think about water assets, all of those tends to be regulated assets. So there is a clear question. And in that particular one, climate resilience is very important. So when we do infrastructure investments, we do extensive due diligence in terms of how resilient those assets are to climate, physical events, what are the mitigation strategies that will adapt those assets to ensure that they are going to be able to serve their purpose. And the terms of investment in infrastructure tend to be minimum 10 years. So the opportunities there are much bigger indeed.
I see a question that's been asked just right now about companies splitting some of their assets, and that indeed is something we've seen E.ON doing a number of years ago. Dong was mentioned, where there was some internal transformation happening. Is that something one of you wants to comment on? Rachel, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I'd refer back to my comments earlier about the approach that many investors take where they do have a mix of green and brown assets, is that they try and be very active owners with regards to the brown asset holdings. So it comes down to their engagement strategy. And if they see the potential for improvement within a particular company or sector where certain best practice technologies, governance structures, operational processes, or R&D, innovative investments aren't being made by the company, then they will engage using all their levers as shareholders to try and encourage better practices. They will, and as I said, they will also file shareholder resolutions to put extra pressure on. And the pressure will come from a coordinated approach, not just one individual investor, but everyone who can have an impact that will work together to get the best outcome. I know that there's always a lot of pressure on investors to just divest from these kinds of companies. It really depends on the individual investor. Some of them are very willing to walk away. Others would rather have the conversation and see if the board and the company is willing to try and take on board the comments and improve and reduce their emissions. And they would rather exert their influence when they're able to do that as shareholders, rather than just hand their shares over to someone else that might be not as active an owner. And while I've got the floor, maybe briefly I'll just respond to Jane's question on investors being able to engage on long-term strategies with governments. I mean, I think, yes, the opportunities are there, and where they are there, we do make full use of them. It really varies by country, and within the EU it can vary by institution, depending on who you want to speak to, and often it can be, the trickier part is not necessarily getting your position out there and well known. It's finding out who the right person to speak to, and trying to join the dots for individual institutions. So the fact that finance and decarbonisation within administrations aren't well joined up as a rule, even in some of the better performing countries, means you often have to do a lot of legwork as a stakeholder externally to make sure that an energy ministry and a climate ministry and a finance ministry are all talking together about the same thing, and have a good understanding of the bigger picture. So that's what we try and focus on in those conversations. Thanks.
Jan van der Moosten, you wanted to react?
I can add a little bit on 2 points. I think the last question about, say, these power utilities that divest, which I think is a bit of a misleading term. They basically either sell their coal assets or put them in separate companies. I think that's something that is exactly an issue where investors could play a role, and where engagement can actually be very, very useful. Because if you just have a divestment approach, then a company that wishes not to be divested from can just sell their coal assets, which will usually go to a company that will be a lot less concerned about closing these coal assets or dealing with these coal assets in a responsible way. So where we believe that investors can play a role is engaging with these utilities, with these companies, trying to convince them exactly not to sell these coal assets, but close them down. And that is the way you can get a real climate benefit in the end. And we're actually working a lot on that within like say the space of civil society organizations that work on coal finance, is which companies investors should target as a priority in Europe, and what questions should they ask them in terms of phasing out their coal assets rather than selling them. So that's a really interesting topic, I think, for investors to consider also, for instance, within the Climate Action 100+ initiative, where there is a few of those important European utilities as part of the target group.
Let me maybe react. I saw there was a question from some of the participants on the transition towards a green investment, and one of them was wondering whether the transition will not be brutal and like a sort of a cliff edge type transition. Is that something that you see potentially as well as a risk, maybe Rachel or Tatiana, that the transition is so sudden that it creates some form of financial market crash?
I think this is a risk because ideally from an investor perspective and really from a very broad economic perspective, the transition should be the most cost-effective one possible. And that means a long-term transition and a gradual one rather than a cliff edge, which then would result in not just very unmanageable rates of change, but also very high costs to very large, if not all sectors of the economy and society. So from the investor point of view, that's why we continue to advocate for clear long-term policies that really are set now, and we do try to convey the urgency both at the EU level and at the international level in terms of enhancing and scaling up NDCs so that they close the gap to the 1.5 degree goal, and are clear in terms of how individual parties are going to achieve those objectives. For us, one of the key factors in all of this is carbon pricing and putting a meaningful and robust price on carbon so that investors and companies can have a transparent way of measuring the broader costs of their operations from a climate change point of view. So we have been very active on the ETS negotiations. The forecasts for the price increases are positive, but whether they'll come soon enough for the gradual transition that we all want is still debatable. So yeah, we're now looking at ways that we could try and do more to support the ETS and broader carbon pricing in advance of those anticipated price increases. Thanks.
I guess part of my question was, could there not be some sort of an unintended consequence of this push for green finance, that if indeed it happens, it might happen so suddenly that it creates more disruption than anything? Is that at all something you would see as a risk or not?
If I may, Tatiana here, let's be very clear that when Mark Carney in 2016 said that climate represents a risk to financial stability, that is very much what he was saying. If, as investors, the only mitigation strategy we see is exit when the pricing becomes, let's say, too high, then indeed you would have what is very classical in financial markets. You would have a boom and a bust, isn't it? So I think the work we are doing is very much towards a smoother transition to ensure that it's not at all in any of our interest to have such disruption in the financial markets. Now, your last point brings me about this question of should we go for green or which are dedicated green products such as, dedicated climate funds or dedicated green bonds, or should we look at the overlay of those strategies across the investment industry. Because it is quite correct that we are a long way to be anywhere a risk that you're mentioning when you just look at the size of green investments which are being done, and to be very precise and labeled or tagged as green, because a lot more are happening which are just not called that way. So I'm not particularly worried about green disrupting the market, but I think the issue of stranded asset is a real one, and not just in oil and gas, which is where the clear focus is, but also, for example, in real estate, where there is a clear risk that some buildings will become obsolete because they are not aligned with regulation, and that is an equivalent of a stranded asset. So the question of the overlay, how do we, which is really, we're speaking about 70 trillions of assets under management into the investment industry alone, plus all of the banks. So this is really where the trillions are, and we are a long way from having a complete overlay. We all agree on that. So I am not particularly worried in the short term that there's going to be such a disruption, but I think engagement is therefore crucial. And I did take your point. I think it's a very good one. Engagement towards phasing out, and organizations such as Carbon Tracker have been very vocal in those particular aspects, and the organizations that we engage with. Our CEO, Sakar Neseheb, is actually the non-exec chairman, for example. So we are very, very closely engaged with those organizations to ensure that indeed we engage on those terms as well with companies. I think we still have some progress to do. Let's be transparent here in that perspective. But it's definitely not something which is off the mark at all. It's just it's going to take more time. So the issue of what is the tipping point is an important one.
Time by some minutes already. So I think we'll close on that, on these words. Tatiana, thanks a lot for answering the question. Rachel and everybody else, thank you for joining this webinar. I hope you found it interesting. I think people can continue the conversation if they want using the online tool. But that's the end of it when it comes to the to our voice conversation, at least. So thanks again to all of you for this very interesting discussion, and certainly we'll be following with interest what is happening with all the initiatives which are being taken around this issue of green finance. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye, and thanks for inviting me.
So that will close the chat.
Good. Well, it is.
Okay, everyone's leaving. Yeah.
Yeah. Quite interesting.